the audience to commemorate the memory of Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha, who was assassinated in 1985, 18th January 1985. He was convicted of apostasy and heresy. And on this occasion, the Sudan Human Rights Organization would like to commemorate his memory and to recall the history of the Sudanese people's struggle for freedom of speech and for a democratic and secular state and for a decent society. Late Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha, in May 1983, he was arrested along with 50 of his senior followers after the declaration of Sharia laws in Sudan by the former dictator Jafar Numeri. And when these Sharia laws became a part of the civil law, they were released along with the other detainees, but Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha continued his struggle and fighting against the so-called Islamic laws, which are well known in Sudan by September laws, for they are contradicting to the Islamic laws. The major incident or the turning issue in the case of freedom of speech was when Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha issued a pamphlet by the title of This or the Great Flood, هذا أو الطوفان. And in that pamphlet, he denounced the so-called Islamic Sharia laws and said that the laws implemented by former dictator Numeri were un-Islamic, against Islamic Sharia, and humiliating and insulting the Sudanese people. Also in that pamphlet, he mentioned that the civil war in the south should be stopped and a political solution should be found for that war. After the issuance of that pamphlet, Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha and some of his followers were arrested. And a Sharia, or actually it wasn't a Sharia court, but it was directed by some of the followers of National Islamic Front, members who are active now in the political scene in Sudan. The court was a unicameral, and after a very short deliberation, they were given the opportunity to repent or to be hanged. Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha did not recognize the court as credible and technically and morally equipped or qualified. He said that the court is not equipped morally and technically, therefore it's not eligible for trying him and his followers. Which convicted Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha by fomenting war and hatred against the state, was switched quickly in no time to a case of heresy and apostasy. And when they came to apply the so-called heretic conviction, the judge relied on let me go to my reference here. The judge said that along with the Sudanese penal code, the judge has got the right to use his own common sense, ijtihad, which means the individual interpretation for the Islamic laws, and qiyas, which is also a personal opinion, a kind of personal opinion. And just for 1 minute. So this occasion sees this opportunity to mention a few words about the ongoing civil war in the South. It's really a very catastrophic one. It is really a shameful war against humanity and against human values. To launch a war, a holy war, a jihad war against your own citizen. Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha mentioned this point in his pamphlet, in his famous pamphlet, that the war in the South should not continue actually, and it should not be given the religious dimension. And he called for a political solution. Now we want to make it more applicable and attainable by following his preaching and his ideas about the peaceful coexistence in Sudan between the different religious groups, as he used to do in his lifetime. So now we have a video tape showing the procedure and the details of the trial of late Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha, the great Sudanese philosopher and the Islamic reformer. It is in Arabic, but I would like to intervene from time to time to show, to make highlights on the important points of this trial. Actually, warning from applying this kind of distorted Islamic Sharia.
التي يقوم بهذه
the problems. And the judge thinks that this is a kind of heresy. The second point is that the pamphlet also called for the abolition of September laws, the so-called against the state, and heresy. And he made a very weak linkage between these 2 points. Actually, there is no Dr. Hassan Turabi and his followers were the senior aides and supporters of dictator Mary, and they were behind the scenes monitoring all these issues, and they also they prepare for this trial. Forgive Ustadh Mahmoud Taha, and he says here that he was hanged.
فما وقر هؤلاء الناس للدفاع عنه كما المتهمون واعترفوا بها بتبجح واصرار وراجعنا السنوات التي قلنا والاقوال التي حوتها يوميه التحري من خطوره هذا الرجل الشيطاني ومن معه من الشباب الضال.
The official reason given for his execution was apostasy. The real reason, however, was and remains to be the fear of those who think that they are the custodians of Islam, of his originality, and of his new vision of Islam. Islam that's based on the Quran and the Sunnah and not on the Sharia. By saying so, Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha was ahead of his times. He was ahead and both head and shoulders above the official interpreters of Islam and the fundamentalists or the people who are called now the political Islam advocates. And Ms. Asma Muhammad Abdul Halim to share their thoughts with us on this great occasion. I could introduce them if I want to and enumerate their achievements and their books, but I don't want to say that because of the occasion. I will leave that to them. And now with Professor Khalid.
He's for one of the very few elections in the whole region as a whole. One of the very few free and fair elections, and they resulted in such a disastrous result for the Islamists. But very interesting that just before the elections, they tried to imitate the NIF, the NIF example in Sudan, by doing something similar in Pakistan. So the scholars whom I met over there are Islamic scholars who have been in the forefront of the battle against this new ideology of Islamism, people who have been many times threatened over the last so many years, who have sometimes lost their jobs, who spent years or decades in the wilderness because of those forces. And for them, Ustadh Mahmoud is a household name, so to say. He is part of what they stand for. He is fully integrated in their way of thinking, in their thought. I also have to admit that my own access to the thought of Ustadh Mahmoud was in a way provided by the many years that I had spent previously before coming to Sudan, that I had spent in Pakistan, where I became thoroughly familiar with Islamic reformist thought. And I remember how some of our friends in Khartoum were surprised that I didn't have any difficulty in understanding Ustadh Mahmoud and sort of getting in tune with his way of thinking. Well, it partly goes back to my teacher in Pakistan, Professor Sayyid Qudratullah Fatimi, certainly the country's greatest historian and philosopher of history, and one of the present-day world's leading Islamic theologians, and a person who has always been in the forefront of the battle against Maududi and Maududism, which has a similar function in Pakistan as Turabi and Turabism as in Sudan. See, when people speak in Pakistan, for them there's just no question, that Ustadh Mahmoud had the role that he had. He is for them a beacon of inspiration. Though on the other hand, certainly there is still a lack of knowledge about him. What has reached over there in terms of articles about him is only piecemeal. Some Pakistani friends of mine have been kind enough to translate some of my own articles about Ustadh Mahmoud from English into Urdu and publish them, which was very dangerous until a short while ago. An obligation upon those Sudanese who were closest to Ustadh Mahmoud that they take this opportunity and do something about it. There is a large new field where in Pakistan, this country with 120 million inhabitants, Muslim country that has gone through this terrible nightmare of Islamism, an 11-year Islamist dictatorship, followed by another 2 years, a kind of a sequel until that Islamist dictatorship petered out. Of course, it is still not over. As somebody told me over there, don't think that it is fully over. The world knows that Afghanistan is a minefield. That in Afghanistan there are millions of Russian mines lying around in the ground. And despite all the efforts by the United Nations to clear those minefields, this has not fully succeeded. And every day, man and animal are still being hurt by those mines lying around Afghanistan. Now, on that analogy, we can say that Pakistan, after 11 or rather 13 years of Islamist dictatorship, is a minefield, just as Afghanistan is. A minefield, not that there are physical mines lying around, but the Islamists who have used this period to lay their mines everywhere in the country, so that future generations of Muslims, of free believers in Islam, that Islamists, despite their small numbers, but the networks they have been able to establish in order to sabotage efforts of Muslims, efforts to come to a new understanding of Islam, efforts to establish a new society built on the principles of Islam as explained and interpreted by Ustadh Mahmoud and other thinkers over there who are sympathetic to his approach or who follow his approach. So that is a hurdle. And the main, or the biggest mine, among those thousands of mines that have been laid there by the Islamists, the biggest mines, I was warned, is that of disinformation. Those scholars in Pakistan warned me of the ability Islamists, whether in Sudan or Pakistan or in Iran or elsewhere, have developed, their ability to cause immense damage by disinformation. If they have learned one thing in terms of modernity, it is this ability, imitated, copied from communist parties, from KGB and so on, this ability of disinformation. Disinformation has become the strongest weapon nowadays of Islamists, be it the Turabi's party in Sudan, or be it the PIF in Pakistan. That is the weapon they are now using more than anything else to hurt reform-minded Muslims elsewhere. Disinformation in the sense of attributing statements or writings to liberal Muslim scholars that have not been produced by those scholars, or that have not, statements that have not been made, all the kind of disinformation tactics that we have become familiar with from KGB tactics, and also sometimes, of course, intelligence services of Western powers. This information, which is one of the tools that have been developed in this modern age, or brought to kind of a completion. This is a tool the Islamists have adopted to their full advantage, and that we have to be very much aware of. Apart from that, this experience in Pakistan, another experience was somewhat earlier in Norway the year before, where a conference took place on human rights in Islam, particularly in North Africa. A conference in which took part scholars from many parts of the world, from the United States, from South Africa, from France, Germany, Algeria, Syria, Sweden, Pakistan, Iran, practically all over. A conference that was, an actual fact, as I discovered then when I was there, that was all devoted to the book written by our friend who is here right in our midst, Dr. Abdullah Ahmad Naim, his book on, which is a kind of an interpretation of Ustadh Mahmoud's thought. So the whole conference, which was a conference of several days, and very high caliber conference, and beautifully organized and extremely effective and successful, the whole conference was actually on this Abdullah Naim book. There was a conference on one book as the main sort of focus, and all the rest was a kind of spreading out from that book into various specialized subjects. Now, being a conference on the book by Dr. Abdullah Ahmad Naim, I would say it was, in a way, a conference on Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha, his legacy. This is in no way any attempt to minimize the independent contribution made by Abdullah in his independent thought and his scholarship and all that. Of course, he, in his book, explains so beautifully how this is derived and developed out of the thought and teachings of Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha. And that was mentioned there throughout and all the time. So we had there in Norway, in Oslo, in 1992, a beautiful international conference of several days, on which now a book has come again. The proceedings of that conference have been published in book form, and that is I couldn't think of any more beautiful way of honoring the legacy of Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha. I have seen another book of a somewhat similar type coming out of Morocco, also honoring, again with a contribution by Abdullah, honoring the legacy of Ustadh Mahmoud. And that, of course, that in a sense is really almost more significant, because naturally anything coming out of the Arab world or Islamic world, honoring Ustadh Mahmoud in that way is, I would say, even a stronger ammunition. Nothing against what our friends or scholars in Norway do. I have had similar experiences in Denmark, in England, in Sweden, in Germany, in Spain, and all those countries. That, I mean, scholars have been very receptive to the thought of Ustadh Mahmoud. But the question always is, what about our own Muslim world, the Arab world? How do people respond over there? So in that sense, I would consider this book on Ustadh Mahmoud's thought, which is again a collection of essays by various scholars. This book that came out of Morocco is perhaps the most significant breakthrough especially since it was conceived as kind of a first step. It is said somewhere in that book that this is just, you know, a first attempt at actually studying the teachings of Ustadh Mahmoud, and that is to be followed by further works of a similar type, more profound studies. This would be my reply to the question, what about the legacy of Ustadh Mahmoud? Certainly I would say that the man of the hour is to have more translations. First of all, to have his books republished in Arabic. The possibility exists now. There are now countries ready, prepared to do that. Tunisia, Morocco, possibly also in Jordan and other countries. A possibility that did not exist before, when people were reluctant to publish this kind of vanguardist, reformist thought. Those hesitations have largely gone. On the contrary, there's now a demand for such type of books. Even in Egypt, I understand there's now an endeavor going on to republish the books by Islamic reform thinkers such as Muhammad Abdu, Ahmad Amin, who played an important role in the first part of the century, but then sort of got pushed aside because of this that media onslaught of the Islamist movement with all the Saudi Arabian oil money behind it, which then financed this flood of books by Maududi, Sayyid Qutb, Hassan Banna, and so on, for many books that flooded the Arab book market and the book market in other Muslim countries. Now, people have become conscious of the fact that something has gone really wrong, that a totally distorted picture has come up because of this manipulation of education and the book market by the petrodollar, the oil money from the Gulf countries. For the first time, I see signs that people really have taken this seriously and are trying to remedy the situation by republishing and disseminating the books of reform thinkers who projected a vision of Islam that is the opposite of what people like Turabi, Khomeini, Abbasi, Ghanouchi, and so on. So there is a very special chance, a very special opening for the thought of Ustadh Mahmoud, something that's come quite suddenly there, something we could not have dreamed of some years ago. Regarding the question that was asked here about the execution of Ustadh Mahmoud, the forces behind the motivations, I feel that this is really something to be looked in a bit more profoundly. I mean, you know, the fact that Sheikh Ibn Baz was after the skin of Ustadh Mahmoud is not really new. It is important always to point out, because I mean, who in the Western world knows who is Ibn Baz and what Ibn Baz does and what Ibn Baz says, things like his fatwa that the earth is flat and that the sun is turning around the earth and these kind of things, and that anybody who says anything else is a kafir, and that he should stand divorced from his wife, and that his wife of course should go to Ustadh Ibn Baz, and all these kind of things. First of all, that I think needs a little more publicity. The fact that such people exist, like Ibn Baz, the kind of things they say, like when the first astronauts went to the moon, the fatwa that is all a lie, that no American ever touched the moon, and those who believe that they touched, they stand divorced from their wives, and all these kind of things. That is, I think, far too little known. And it is important to publicize that in order to make clear really what happened here. What was the problem with Ustadh Mahmoud? You cannot understand why the man was executed if you don't understand the other side, what primitivity exists over there, what primitivity with what power behind, the power of the petrodollar. That is 3 times primitivity, power, petrodollar. But still then, the question here is, since we who know that this has been going on for years or for decades, this opposition against Ustadh Mahmoud and attempts from that establishment, religious establishment in Saudi Arabia, to harm him, still the question is, what happened at that particular juncture? Why did it happen at that time in '85? What caused the thing finally to erupt and have such a tragic end? I think this is a question that needs to still to be investigated more, especially in view of the fact that it happened shortly before the break occurred between Numeri, his regime, and the Muslim Brothers. And Ustadh Mahmoud was executed, and little later, Turabi was thrown into jail. So it's not just a matter of, Turabi's having engineered the execution. Of course, he had been pushing for it, he was one of the driving forces behind it, he bears an enormous amount of responsibility, and yet it is apparent that there was something else. Now, my own research leads me to believe or to conclude that what caused this tragic thing was primarily a business deal. I throw this into the discussion, so to say. I may be wrong, but that's how it appears to me and what I gather from a large number of reports and writings on the subject. The main momentum was probably provided by Numeri's, or rather his Minister of the Interior's deal the agreement to have the Falasha, the Ethiopian Jews, transported through Sudan to Israel, for which, as we know, the Vice President cashed $2 million. The problem was the possible opposition that the regime, Numeri and his regime as a whole, had to expect as a result of this deal. Knowing the situation in the Arab world, it was to be expected that this would cause an enormous uproar, a wave of protest, and could seriously jeopardize the regime. So something had to be done to make good for this deal. The question of I don't know how early it became known what money was received for this deal. It was, of course, not a humanitarian gesture. I think that is, probably nobody has ever had any illusion as to, or what, it was not a question of Numeri's alliance with the United States. The relations were not that good. It was not a question of any kind of humanitarian responsibility or a question of policy with Ethiopia. None of those factors played a role. It was solely a question of money, that they got paid and they did it. We are not discussing the issue whether this was right or wrong. I personally subscribe to the view that Ethiopia was such a hell at that time that any single person that could be saved out of Ethiopia ought to have been saved. And as such, this was not a move to be opposed if anyone subscribes to any kind of humanitarian feelings. The question is we were not dealing here with the regime known for humanitarianism. And on the contrary, a regime that had been thoroughly corrupt and that reached a peak of corruption yet. Now, after the execution of Ustadh Mahmoud, which then took place, we see that this regime did not face any kind of opposition for this move that was organized over there, the transport or this permission given to have the Farasha transported through Sudan to Israel. Something was surprising, because in the normal circumstances, as we know the conditions in the Arab world, this would have created a hue and cry and uproar and all kinds of opposition and break off perhaps the diplomatic relations, Saudi Arabia with Sudan or other countries with Sudan and so on. Nothing of that type happened. The information that's available to me so far was that this was the deal. After it happened, okay, we shut our mouths. You cashed your money, you did what you did, but on one condition: we want this man to be removed. I think if you look at also the video and the full speech of Nomeris, that rambling speech on which he tries to justify the execution, you see one thing very clearly, that he is addressing someone that is not the Sudanese people, that is not also just a question of him giving a kind of a summary of events to himself, or anything of that type. It's very evident that he plays to the galleries. He talks to someone who is to be kind of gratified or satisfied. And we have first the result of when it happened, and there were those telegrams. The telegram that was sent by Ibn Baz, the telegram that was sent by Dr. Omar Nasif, the then head of the Muslim World League, all those telegrams that were published prominently in Saudi Arabian papers, telegrams expressing congratulations to President Omeri for finally having executed this heretic, I think it was used, apostate, heretic, criminal has also been used in one of those texts, Mortad al-Mujrim, Mahmoud Mohammed Taha. So a very evident and very clear interplay that took place here. I don't say that this is the last word. I would say that if this is how it was, and it is in itself meaningful in many ways, because it does show that it's not really so much a question of a difference of opinion in theology that counts for what's going on in our Muslim world today. What are actually the more the driving forces are power, is selfishness, is self-aggrandizement. These are much stronger motivations than actual theological disputes or difference of opinion on questions of Quran interpretation and so on. We can illustrate that in many other instances with all the Islamist parties in different countries. Major concerns in my studies to analyze the Islamist movement in terms of fascism in the world of Islam, a regional manifestation of fascism, a fascism specific to the Muslim world.
I'd like to give an account of my personal era at that time, of the time of Ustadh Mahmoud and his execution. Well, at first, we all thought it was a joke. Because, well, hey, I'm a lawyer, this is the penal code. It doesn't say apostasy. There is no crime. So he could not be tried for that crime, because there is no such crime in the penal code or in any other code in the Sudan at that time. But then the trial went on, and the judgment came. And then we still thought, no, that was just to take our minds off the deteriorating situation. And we still, I think most of us regret that we didn't think seriously about that. We didn't know, actually we didn't know not we didn't think, we didn't know that it's going to happen. We always thought this is just a political maneuver because everything was turned upside down at that time, and everybody could see that the government is in its last days. And at the same time, I think we made the mistake of not taking the people who were pushing this seriously. And we all thought that the Sudan is going to remain the Sudan we knew before. After the judgment, we kept saying, well, I think it was naive, even at that time, to take the penal code again and say, well, or the Criminal Procedure Act, and say, well, it says right here, if somebody is 70 years or older, you don't execute them. So even if he was convicted, and there is a judgment, there is no way that anybody would execute Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha. But all of this happened. And I remember on the day of the judgment, and that the judge was saying that people would have 3 days or so to repent, I said, well, okay. I think Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha and the others are going to repeat what everybody is telling them to repeat just to end this play. And an older member of the family said, Ustadh Mahmoud won't. And that older member of the family, I know, was not in agreement with Ustadh Mahmoud on everything. And he agreed with some of the things, but he disagreed strongly with other things that Ustadh Mahmoud was saying. That person said, Ustadh Mahmoud is not going to retract what he said because he will not let us down. The word that struck me is us. At that moment of time, that person identified with Ustadh Mahmoud, saw him as the person who is presenting his case. And he found himself to be one of those people that Ustadh Mahmoud was standing up for. So he said Ustadh Mahmoud is not going to repent because he will not let us down. And that would happen. The man did not let us down. Also at that time, executions were not public. And that was the first public execution in Sudan. It was in broad daylight, and it was open for people who actually went there to witness the execution of Ustadh Mahmoud. And that was another thing that terrified and terrorized. And we all, after that, I think we all went into a state of being petrified or something, not knowing what to do. And then I found out that I'm not one of few people who had this feeling. I was one of so many people, of the majority of people, even of those who knew Ustadh Mahmoud only by name, or from the rumors that other people were making about him. At that moment of time, they all identified with the man. They saw other people who are, of course, everybody knows about the feud now between Manazir Bhutto and her brother. And now everybody is saying, well, according to Islam, her brother should be the one. He is more entitled. And her mother actually told the BBC that according to the Quran, her brother should be the ruler, not Benazir Bhutto. And I don't know whether she meant the Bhutto families in the Quran, or there's something that mentions brothers and sisters in the Quran, and they should, and who should go after the father. Well, neither is in the Quran. For those who haven't read the Quran does not indicate of how those kings or rulers rule or come to power. Muslims have to develop their own way of going into power. And every time, especially in Pakistan, every time they do something in this westernized democracy that they have, and it turns against their wills, against what they want, they will reach out for the traditional interpretation and say, well, Brazil Poto is a woman. She can't rule, a woman cannot rule in Islam. At the same time, they went to those election boxes and they voted for Brazil Poto. And she won the elections. And when they turned their back, they found refuge in Islam. This was exactly what Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha was against. The discrimination and the subordination of human beings one to the other on basis of sex, of race, and specifically on basis of sex. Because people would find so many things in Islam to support their ideas, to support what they say about discrimination on sex in Islam. This is exactly what Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha was against. And I think now that everybody is suffocating under the traditional interpretation of Islam, there are going to be thousands and thousands of hands reaching out for the soul of Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha. As for the Sudan, I think the Sudanese people are reaching out now more than ever. At that time, people said, the best they were saying is that if Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha wanted to say something, well, freedom of thought for everyone, he can say it. Nobody wanted to speak. There are a group of people who wanted to speak. Now everybody is thinking of himself or herself as a sacrifice. Because if that person could be sacrificed just to protect a group of people who have a certain traditional interpretation of Islam that they would like to impose on everybody, then those people can reach out and sacrifice anyone, anytime. At this moment of time, Islam in the Sudan is a matter of politics. Islam in the Sudan is full of lies. Lies about discrimination, lies about religious freedom, lies about relationship with the rest of the world. To the extent that as Sudanese, we don't know whether we are expressing the right sentiments towards Islam in our own country. Because what we believe is not what's being applied to us. What we believe is not the Islam that would lead to the hunger and to the war that's happening now in the country. And again in 1963, this is exactly what Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha had said. He said that the Islam that's being applied or advocated now, if not reformed, if applied to the people, it is going to be something foreign, it is going to be something that would lead to the downfall of the people, to the humiliation of the people. It will just create a fundamentalist despotism. And this is exactly the prediction he made. This is exactly what's happening now in the Sudan. So the hope, I think, and the thing that is going to help us perhaps feel a little bit better about the degree of naivety that we practiced at one time because we just weren't looking to see would be to reach out for these great thoughts. And I'm sure that there are so many people who would take even what Ustadh Mahmoud said further because Ustadh Mahmoud was never an advocate of freezing thoughts, of manipulating thoughts, or monopolizing thoughts. He made a very famous statement that was almost a household word. That's freedom for us and for everybody else. So it's open for everybody else. It's open for the Republican brothers to have this thought brought out to the world, given to the hands that are reaching out for it. Thank you.
Freedom of thought in the Arab world and the Islamic world, I consider it as a social hypocrisy in many Islamic countries. This is regarding the freedom of thought. Going back in Islamic State to the Spain, Cordoba, when the great thinker Averroes, I would say in Arabic, Ibn Rushd, had been executed and his book burned. Also, we go back to Egypt during the Enlightenment, and Dr. Taha Hussein, also his book in the Arabic verses had been banned by Al-Azhar. This is another thing. The other thing, in 1930, The Origin of Islam by Ali Abdel Razik, also his book had been banned, and also they called him an atheist. This is another thing. And later in Egypt, there is a professor, his name is Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid. Some people in Egypt, they want to divorce him from his wife because they think he is unbeliever. This is another thing. The other thing also we have here is interpretation of Quran. It is very difficult to interpret Quran and try to put it into the modern life, because sometimes there is a lot of contradiction on that. And according to that also, the divine rights, because some people, they think that they have the divine rights to tell people what is right and what is wrong, which is not correct or right in the natural law. This is other thing. The other thing, in the third world countries and the Arab countries also, there is a thing called folklore culture. That's culture people talk to each other. We don't have a written culture, written in books like archives, like that you can go to like a source of references, and everything is written on that to answer it out. For example, maybe in Sudan, 85% illiterate and ignorant. Sometimes people, they don't know how to write and read. So all these things, when we talk about some intellectuals, especially Muslim brothers, they think all this idea is implemented by the West and Western ideas that to destroy Islam, which is wrong. We have also the example of Muhammad Abdu and Sheikh Jamal al-Din al-Afghani. And the movement...
I'm sure Dr. Khalid would like to answer that.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I had this experience myself in Pakistan when I went there the second time in 1968. I joined the Islamic Research Institute, which is a government institution created in 1965 to advise the Pakistan government on Islamic affairs. I joined that institute on invitation by the late Professor Fadl Rahman. I was hardly there when an agitation was started against him because of that book. Well, it appeared to be because of the book. In actual fact, it was not. But the book was made a tool against him. What people actually wanted was to topple the government. The government of that President Ayub Khan. They felt that religion was the easiest way of mobilizing the masses. They mobilized the masses by reference to a book written in English. They mobilized masses illiterate in their own language, Urdu here, Bengali there, against a book written in a very difficult English. And we had this phenomenon in those days in Dhaka, now capital of Bangladesh, in those days still East Pakistan, with 10,000 people demonstrating against this book. Practically all of them illiterates in their own Bangla language, protesting against a book written in faraway England in English. Nobody had read the book, but they demonstrated. They went on the rampage, and as you know, what then happens, police has to keep some order, and the attempt was to make the police kill a few demonstrators and then have, you know, bigger agitation and so on. There's a pattern to that. It has been repeated time and again. We have it later on with Rushdie. All that happened with Rushdie, it's not the first time. It had been exercised before. So the basic issue to my mind here is, you know, how is it possible, first of all, you know, to mobilize these people? I'm convinced, I may be wrong, but I'm convinced that if those people had had some education, and if there were not this ratio that you mentioned, 85% illiterate, the same ratio in Pakistan, the same ratio in many other countries, if we didn't have this problem, it would probably not be that easy for political opportunists to use religion as a handle, as a tool for their own self-promotion, as we have seen so many times over the last 2-3 decades in different parts of the Muslim world. You know, the question of drought that had before in several countries had a terrible impact on the animal stock. In Morocco, His Majesty, I'm not speaking on his behalf here, but His Majesty was rational and appealed to the population to please stop the animal sacrifice on the Muslim festival of sacrificial feast. Saying that we have first to replete the animal stock. If you start all slaughtering on this occasion, with all that loss that we have suffered because of the drought, there will be a catastrophe. What happened, as usually at such occasions, that some imams who wanted to gain a profile preached to their parishioners to do the contrary, to sacrifice more than usual. If their parishioners, I think, had some basic education that would enable them to understand the reasoning, in this case of the king, I do not think that those imams would have had that impact on those masses. But we have time and again seen that attempts at reform are being stifled, are being crushed, because it is easy to mobilize illiterate masses when you tell them that your faith, your Islam is in danger. It was not very different in previous centuries. When you mentioned Cordoba with Rushd, Averroes, we have the same example with the Mu'tazila school of thought in 9th century Baghdad, where we had the Muslim Enlightenment. And Enlightenment, like nothing behind the Enlightenment we have many centuries later in Europe. But how was it possible for one caliph, the Caliph al-Mutawakkil, playing to the galleries, playing the fundamentalist cards, Ahmad ibn Hanbal and so on, then to crush this enlightenment, to say from one day to the other, overnight? To my mind, it is because of the imbalance in education. What we had then was this highly sophisticated, educated class in 9th century Baghdad, predating, so to say, 17th, 18th century Europe, but based on a basis of illiteracy. The Enlightenment that took place in Europe did not have that base of illiteracy. First, we had a kind of an expansion of general education. And as this general education in my mind, that made the European Enlightenment successful. Because there were similar attempts by the official churches, by fundamentalist groups and so on, to thwart that European Enlightenment. But it didn't work because they didn't have that appeal among the masses. The masses had already sufficient general education so as to form their own judgment and look at these things more coolly and calmly. There was not anymore that fear. It was not easy to make them fear for the safety of their faith the way it is still in much of the Muslim world. Because we do have now some changes, despite the fact that illiteracy, that's what it is. Look at the literature, more than 50% deals with the question of sexual morals, the family, and the position that women should have. Sometimes you read beautiful statements, all of to have their own way of reading Russian or other Eastern Bloc statements. When they talked about democracy, it meant something different from the democracy we are talking about. When they talked about people's rights, it meant something different from the people's rights we are talking about. So similarly, when they talk about female rights, women's rights, it means something very different from what we are understanding by it. That there has to be full clarity on that. Besides, also, in the Eastern Bloc countries, in most elections in the Eastern Bloc countries, during the first elections, the old regime came through again, because people had no confidence in the new order. Within the second election, take Albania, the first elections, the old regime, people, the communists, they won the elections. Then they were repeated in the second, people had that understood. There is really democracy, we have a chance. So they really voted them, and then those people disappeared. The same thing would have happened in Nigeria. When people forget that a year earlier, they had, that's certainly true, won municipal elections. And everybody in Nigeria said, yes, we did it, we voted for them. Not because of love for them, but because we wanted to tease the government. Okay. They did that, and very soon they repented. Now, the FIS had a hold on power. And they use it immediately, like totalitarian parties do, to manipulate elections. It's not the government, the central government, that falsified. They were the ones who saw to it that they became a strong party, never a majority. But neither did they win the elections. It's absolutely wrong to say that the FIS and the Islamists won the elections in Nigeria. It's not true. It's a question of very simple mathematics. They certainly emerged in those elections as the strongest single party. But that's all. I mean, that you have in many countries of the world, that you have the strongest single party was not ruling, was in the opposition, because the others altogether are stronger.
The fact that people usually don't think collectively. There's someone who comes up with a certain idea, and then people would follow that idea and develop it. My personal experience is that I have never been in a discussion group that had Ustadh Mahmoud himself in. I have always been in a discussion group that was led by other Republican brothers. So it wasn't just one person steering. It was everybody. They were having discussion groups at universities, even locally, in the local communities, and those were not manipulated or led by Ustadh Mahmoud. And I'm sure that in the university, all the discussion groups that I have attended, he wasn't even present there. And he wasn't giving any, feeding anybody any information. People were entertaining their own thoughts. They were making their own discussion. The reason that it did not have the popularity that it should have in the Sudan, because of the way we are brought up to think what Islam is. And everybody, I think, will be surprised that this government, in its first year, had a very large popularity among the people. Not because they came with something new or the salvation, as they said, but because they represented something that did not stir anything in with the people, that did not bring in anything new. The other thing is the rate of illiteracy that Dr. Khalid, Professor Khalid brought up, that we inherit Islam. We don't become Muslims because we have read something, and I think that applies to all other religions. People are born in a Jewish family, they are Jewish, in a Christian family, they are Christians, in a Muslim family, they are Muslims. But then we did not enjoy the enlightened, literal life that's being enjoyed, for example, in Europe or in other countries. We just inherit Islam, a certain version of it, and most of the time, it could be a very local version. There are local versions in the north, a local version in the west, a local version in the east of Sudan, and we are all absolutely for this local version. And then our level of education did not help us. So if you take the level of education in account, you will find that the followers or the Republican brothers at that time were not a minority within the elite. They of course, they started as a minority, but the time the Ustadh was executed, I don't think amongst the elite they were a minority, especially with people, for example, like myself and other people who were not committed Republican brothers, but were there all the time, trying to find something new.
Yeah, I would like to answer this question. They knew how to deal with this. And I would like to give you an example from my own hometown, Adbara. In Adbara, the Communist Party was very strong. But most of the people there, being from the north, from Shangia tribe, they were Khatmir. They were with the party that there is loyalty. However, when the elections came every year or every few years, the people sent to the parliament were from Khatmir. But every year the people sent to the trade union were communist. The trade unions, the communists will fight for increase of salary, they can have confrontation with the system. And they understand that very well. But at the other level, they don't want to give up that. And I think as far as Jamhuriyin are concerned, there is something similar to that. I remember when I was at the university at the time, and the Jamhuriyin, the brothers and the sisters will come and talk. We will go, hundreds of us, and listen to them. When they go in different towns and talk, we will come and listen to them. But the Sudanese society was not yet ready for them organizationally. So that's why when Professor Mahmoud, when Ustadh Mahmoud was executed, many people felt that they were mad about it, but they couldn't come out and say it. I wouldn't say that's hypocrisy, but I would say that the society was not ready for them. And what NIF has done in the last 4 years made people realize that, yes, tragic, but that's the reality of it. And that's why I said in the beginning that maybe those kids who are running around
by Marx and Lenin, was the Chinese ready for change by Mao? I think the society was ready to accept Mahmoud. And the people who fostered change like it. But the society itself is so divided against itself in terms of ethnic grouping, in terms of Islamic affiliations. And that's why we can say the society is not ready for change, to accept it. The society, as a matter of fact, did not have the, let me say, it didn't have, it was ready for him. And it was ready to receive other people like Muhammad Mohammed, for example, in the 19th century or so.
The fusion of Mahmoud Mohammed Taha was the first cause of Tifada, which thrown out the regime at the Intifada was called the Mary regime. Thank you.
Okay. So the situation was fertile for making such.
Recognize a fake when they see one. Nimeri perhaps would have been able to stay for one more year or so had he stayed out of Ustadh Mahmoud's camp. Because, for example, my father or my uncle was ready for anything but President Nimeri talking about Islam. That was not acceptable at all. Right now, everybody's talking to the Sudanese people about preserving the faith. We would like to preserve the Islamic faith to saviour this world. The demonstrations that are going out on the streets now are telling the government the faith is preserved. Where is the gas? Where is the food? And the slogan always starts with, we preserve the faith. Now, where is, what's your promises?
Where is the food?
What's the real?
Where is the food?
In the north, then we have no chance of any unity in the country. We may have a geographical unity in the way we have it now, but we won't have a unity in the sense that we become one nation. Because some of us see themselves as the power holders. And the struggle between the South and the North has always been a power struggle. Now it is being fueled by some religious leaders, by the jihad and the call for jihad, and this is not helping us out. So if we don't, then I think it's very simple. You just have to reform the way you think about your Islam. You just have to reform yourself as a Muslim, so as to be able to deal with those who are different or other than you.
Well, I would like another one, women. And I think he was ahead in this area. And sometimes I'm really surprised that the Southerners are not coming out forcefully to speak about this aspect in Mahmoud's ideas and what he was talking about. Because he came out, I don't know anyone who came out so early and discussed this situation. And he said that under Sharia, the minorities will not be able to rule. They will be treated as dhimmis. And he tried to show the difference between being a dhimmi and being a citizen. You see, because in modern society, you are a citizen, that you're supposed to have all rights. There is no discrimination. And he said that Sharia does not provide any room for minorities because they are treated as second-class citizens. And that was a very strong statement, and it remains to be a statement, a very strong statement. So I think your question is very relevant to what we are, the Republican Brothers are about, minorities and women in the Constitution. I think that we are supposed to leave this place here by 4. We have only 8 minutes, so I don't know if the two speakers would like to give some final comments before we leave. Khalid, would you like to
conclude from that? Good can come out of it, I guess, if you, as Sudanese in opposition to this regime, take a clear stand, and not only take a clear stand because we're not opposed, we do that, but I mean, give it wide publicity, the fact that you oppose this regime the way you do, and also the alternatives to it, what was mentioned right now here, to explain clearly to all the world that the country can be run by a non-Muslim, non-Arabic speaking person. As it has been run since independence by Arabic speaking Muslims, it is, as a matter of fact, high time to have
the